Hello, everyone, and welcome to Anatomy of an Adaptation, a podcast in which we read classic books and then compare them to their cinematic retellings. I'm your host, Nicolo Grasso, and I'm joined today by writer and academic Alden Nagel. Thank you so much, Alden, for being here. How are you doing?
Hi, Nick. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here. Very excited. We're both fighting the scorching summer heat
We
to
certainly
be
are,
here.
yes.
Summer heat and the vast ocean that's separating us at this moment. Um,
Certainly.
yeah, but we're
Yeah.
here today to talk about one of the classics of sci-fi, of one of the classic stories of the sci-fi genre, both in book form and in film form. Because of course today we're talking about Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers and Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky. I think we both come to this story primarily knowing the movie Stalker, but I'm curious, Alden, what was it like for you to read the book by Arkady Strugatsky and Boris Strugatsky, of course, published in 1972, Russian Soviet era novel that kind of transcended its country and place of origin and became a true staple of the sci fi genre? What's kind of your experience with this book? Was this your first time reading it for this podcast, or did you read it before? Tell me everything. I'm very curious about your thoughts on it.
I believe I'd read it around the time that I'd first lobbied you to do this podcast.
Okay.
Because I'd wanted to for a while. Um, because of course it's a classic. Not that I usually, read books that I'm a fan of. I have no really traditional or conservative thoughts on, adaptations, right?
Mm-hmm.
On books or films being inherently better or whatever. But to me, in regards to the book directly, it's odd because I feel like I can't really introduce how I feel about the book without talking about the movie, right? Having
Of
seen it
course.
before and having seen every Tarkovsky movie at least once, um, Stalker and Solaris being the ones I've seen more than once. Uh, uh, it's odd because his movies are so recognizable and so iconic in
Mm-hmm.
the ways that everyone knows them to be, but tonally and pacing wise, they they feel very big and yet very slow, right? These meditative behemoths of movies. But it's hard to translate that to a book. But obviously, that's not how it went, right? It wasn't a
Mm-hmm.
movie that became a book, it's a book that became a movie. And so it's not that I had expectations that were, not met or broken or something when I read it. It's just a completely different idea of the motif. Because,
Yes.
as I'm sure we're going to return to in this podcast today, the movie and the book are vastly different, which is interesting considering that the movie's screenplay was written by the Strugatsky brothers. Not just obvious, yeah. So the end piece of it all is so vastly different. I mean, characters and scenes and stylistic ideas.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that they're only joined by this idea of the zone, right? As this recurring primary motif in both pieces. But it's almost like there's not. Uh, yeah, it's not like that's not the only thing, but they're so vastly different, right? About the book, let me return to the book real quick to keep it on track.
Yeah.
Uh, I thought that, well, it's interesting because I think anyone going into this thinking, first off, that it's going to be a, a hard piece of genre fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a really adroit piece of, science fiction, with all the things that you anticipate with science fiction. It's not really there, right? The idea of, alien battles and futuristic technologies and all these things, right? So yeah, I thought it was interesting. It was much more pulpy. I'll say that much. It was much closer to like a pulp novel than I originally thought it would be,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Because, for example, if you compare it to the author whose books have been made into other slow cinema films, such as Krasnoorka's, I believe I'm saying that very wrong, but Krasnoorka's books, which have been turned into Bellatar's films.
Hmm.
Um, it's interesting because tonally there's big differences there as well. That also are apparent just in the very different mediums, right? But I don't want to escape and talk more about the screenplay in the movie again too much because I know I'd be tempted to. Again, the book I thought was fine. It felt very pulpy, very funny at times, which I thought was interesting. You
Borderline
know,
satirical, even at points, it feels like.
right,
It's
right.
reaching.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of comments about about sex and women and drinking, which it is very very passive in the movie, right? So it feels funny. It feels much more hearty in a sense. So it's a completely different idea entirely, right?
Mhm.
About the book, did I enjoy it? I did. I did. I rarely read science fiction, even if we can call it science fiction in a very abstract sense, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like I could keep rambling there. What did you think of the book? Was it your first time reading it and preparing for this podcast?
Yes, indeed. It was my first time reading it. And I have to second what you just said. Actually, I will take it from there. I'm also not a big science fiction reader or enjoyer, even when it comes to cinema. I think anyone that's been listening to the podcast for a long time knows that. Funnily enough, the last time I really talked about it was a year ago or so when uh, I did an episode on Solaris of all the
Right,
sci-fi
right.
stories. But I'm very much more interested in science fiction that takes place on Earth, that is very grounded, that's not like, even to be honest, I can appreciate someone like Isaac Asimov. But
Hmm.
even then, it goes a bit too much into robotics and those types of sci-fi stories that I can appreciate. I can respect them, I can enjoy them, but I'm never drawn to them. But there is something about Roadside Picnic that is very grounded, is very lived in a way that is much more intriguing to me and also welcoming as a reader, because we as the readers are experiencing the story kind of in the same way that the characters in the book are. We are entering this established world where you have these zones that you've mentioned, which are these uh, areas coming on that showed up seemingly randomly on a line that crosses the world, that are remnants of an alien visit. What were the aliens doing here? How did the aliens even look like? No one knows. It just kind of like showed up one day and had left all of this junk, you could say, uh, on Earth. And so humanity doesn't know really what's happening here in the zone. And then us as readers are also kind of unsure of what's going on. Um, it took a while for me to get truly invested in the book. I don't know if you felt similar. Also, because the iconography of the film is so impossible to escape, and not even the film. I'm also a gamer. I'm a big fan of video games, and there is a series of video games called Stalker that are more based on Roadside Picnic than they are actually on the film by Tarkovsky, and they do share more of the visual language of the film than the book. But regardless, to read about some of the scientific elements here, like those robot suits that they get in to explore the zone in a safe way, the scientists that are trying to gather those relics that have been left behind and then studying them, trying to see if there's some power to harness, if there's anything that can be done with them. I found it really compelling the longer the story went on, but not even because of the world itself, but because of the main character, Redrick Schuhart. Um, a very, very interesting man. I don't know how you felt about him as a protagonist to follow in the book, and also not to follow him in one day, because that was my idea. Of course, going back to Stalker, we're going to talk about it, but that's set primarily in one day, kind of 2 nights, maybe at most. But this one jumps across decades, across multiple years, which really took me by surprise, and I was not expecting it.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, going back to the trappings of science fiction as a genre, again, we
Hmm.
see this way more in Roadside Picnic, right? Like you're saying, with the idea of these suits and this zone that is, I mean, it's hard to quantify in the sense that's not the right word, comprehend, in the sense of what really to immediately compare it to, because there's the obvious, God, I mean, there's the obvious ideas of it being, like a nuclear waste infected zone, right?
Hmm.
Very meta commentary on Chernobyl, which I believe was contemporary to the time of Stalker.
Almost a
And
decade, actually. Chernobyl, we are in the 40th anniversary now, 1986.
so
So it
much
actually
closer.
all of, I think there was, I forgot to write it down. Apologies, but there was
Oh,
also
you're fine.
similar nuclear incident that happened in the late 60s to early 70s that kind of inspired the Strugatsky brothers, but then also the visual motifs in Tarkovsky's film.
Certainly, certainly.
Yeah.
Well, um, what I couldn't help but think about when I was both reading the book and, of course, rewatching the movie. Um, this connects back to the zone, I promise. Was Adam Curtis's hypernormalization? I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, yeah, I have, I
Yes,
have.
because he makes explicit reference to that, and I want to point out that that's not the only movie of his that he references Tarkovsky. I think in his film Bitter Lake, he references Solaris, which is funny because in Bitter Lake, not that Bitter Lake is a bad movie, they're both great. It, a bit more shoehorned in, but little more forced. Anyways, to me, if you remember how he discussed it, the idea of or how he included it, right, is as commentary, is that when the Strugatsky brothers were writing Roadside Picnic, they were thinking of it not just sure as this very interesting concept to write a book about and unexplored avenues of science fiction and speculative literature,
Hmm.
but also commentary on their own time, right? Which is very much where the Adam Curtis film of the name Hypernormalization gets its name from. That being, they were living in a time in Soviet Russia when everyone knew that there was so much theater and propaganda around them
Hmm.
that it wasn't just normal way of things, right? Very normal surface level governments that have their transparency, but they aren't lying so intensely much, right?
Hmm.
And everyone has to act as if they don't know that they're being lied to,
Like to
right? But it's not.
pretend that everything is
Yes,
normal.
right. Which is, of course, where the name hypernormalization comes from. In uh, in Roadside Picnic, it's interesting because this seems to be where they really get the idea of the zone as this as sorry, I'm thinking real time here, as this commentary on that hypernormalization, right?
Hmm.
Of this space where physics don't necessarily apply to how they we may think they do. Time doesn't apply, right? So it's, even though it is very abstracted, right, and unknown what the effects are really on people, in the sense of what it's like to experience the zone and have time and space be altered in it. It is ultimately grounded in very hard commentary about the time they're living in, although of course masked in this level of abstraction,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And I want to return to this talking about Tarkovsky later when we get to the film, because in rewatching Stalker last night, I couldn't help but think that it's interesting that we talk about Tarkov. I will make this quick. I promise.
Of
It's
course,
interesting that we
take your time.
talk. It's interesting that we talk about Tarkovsky's films in these very abstracted, poetic, spiritual senses,
Yeah.
because of course that's not just what he intended and what they are, but they're also grounded in very real commentary about the world around him, right? Like this is very like hardy theories, theoretical political stuff he's dealing with,
Hmm.
right? You know, the sacrifice deals with anxieties around nuclear war, obviously, right? They say that.
Hmm.
Um, Ivan's childhood and Andrei Rublev are, of course, very literal in this. They're essentially historical films in their own senses. Roadside Picnic is different, and of course, Stalker is different in this because I can't even see. It's obvious to say that maybe the closest comparison within Tarkovsky's films are to that Stalker is Solaris, but even that doesn't feel right. You
Hmm.
know, there's something so um, atmospheric and unknown, right? I mean, it, in the book, to bring it back to the book, it is very grounded and explained that it's probably an alien intervention, right? Whether aliens came and had some presence on this area that would be called the zone, right? Um, what aliens? Who were they? Why they did it? What the extent of those things are? It's hard to say, right? And I think that's where a lot of the wonder and magic of both the book and the movie come from, right? Because it's
The
not
uncertainty, all of the
right,
uncertainty.
but it's not a horror, right? Uncertainty. This is not this isn't Annihilation, right? The book or the movie, right?
No.
Where obviously that zone, I forget what it's called in Annihilation, but the area in that is a place of horror, right?
Hmm.
In the zone, it's obviously much different, and I think it's like a dissonant kind of beauty in that sense, you know. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, what are you thinking?
Yeah. It made me think, as you were mentioning, that this element of ambiguity is what ended up making the book really compelling. And funnily enough, I don't know if you agree with this, but the most interesting section of the book is not when they're in the zone, it's not when you're following Red on his, like you mentioned, pulpy adventures, getting into fights and running away. He has that, he has this and that. No, it's a sequence where you have the characters of Richard Noonan and Dr. Pillman. They're just talking in the bar, in the Borscht uh,
Mm-hmm.
bar. That entire passage, I thought it was going to be, it's like, okay, now the book is slowing down. It is so compelling to see, to read those two different perspectives, but also to read the character of the doctor who's a Nobel laureate as well, or something like that. Is the highest thinker. He thought up a whole theory of why the aliens came and how they came through the world and left those specific zones in those specific areas. He's the one that pretty much analyze them first properly. Of course, again, in the fictional realm of the book, but they get into this conversation that also tackles on um, faith and belief in a way that can lead to societal changes, usually for the worse. There is this element where they talk about how people that migrate from areas near the zone to somewhere else kind of bring catastrophic cataclysms with them. And it feels like this how people used to have at the time and even now still have, anti-immigrant stances where you try to find a reason to kick someone out. And in this book he also mentions it is like, is it actually happening, or is it just something that would have happened regardless, but just by having someone coming from the zone, from near the zone to this new area, is polluting it and dooming it to disaster, because then you have typhoons and you have earthquakes and everything destroying them. There's some of those social elements in the book, in the meaning behind the zone, like you mentioned as well, no one has seen those aliens. They keep talking about them. They could look like, ET, or they could look like a xenomorph. They could be giants, maybe even. We have no idea. and
Right.
this idea, this feeling of powerlessness is disturbing and scary for just, existentialism in a way. This topic kind of comes back through what the characters are doing, especially Red, the protagonist. His sole purpose in life has become to go to the zone. Everyone else is trying to look for fame, for glory, for riches, and he very gradually realizes the only thing he can do is just go in the zone. He's done it so many times. He's an expert. He's never gotten hurt. He always comes back alive. He has a wife, but he doesn't. He's not motivated by love. Really, he has a daughter who's mutated because of his constant journeys through the zone. Um, that's looking less and less human by the day. So he's connected to her just by being his daughter, but he doesn't have anything deeper that takes him there. So I don't know. I'm also kind of rambling right now, but because the book itself, I wouldn't say it's unfocused, but it's just very broad with the type of elements that it touches on. And up until
Right.
the end, then it becomes a bit more focused in the last chapter when you get into this intense trip to the zone, looking for the golden sphere, which is also intriguing. I don't know if you have anything to add about what I just said or the golden sphere.
Well, I will say that returning to the main character,
Mhm.
and his, his desires and intentions, it's interesting because he's a very his character is very, especially in the book, very much like a hustler kind of character, right? Like he almost seems like, admittedly, having seen the movie so many times and Tarkovsky films in general
Yep.
before reading the book, I was almost taken aback, not shocked, but I almost found it kind of like funny how different it was, because I mean he seems more almost like a character out of Train Spotting than than
Yes.
this like atmospheric, very interior focused spiritual wandering figure.
Mhm.
But yeah, in the book, I mean, in the book again, he's essentially just a hustler and a smuggler, right? Because he doesn't he's not a scientist. This is made really clear. I don't just mean he's literally not a scientist, but his interests in it aren't abstracted scientific notions, right? Or the glory that comes with being known as a scientist, right? He's
Yep.
not searching for a Nobel Prize, certainly, as other characters are. And he's not going into it out of curiosity and he's I mean, obviously, we can say a million things that he's not, right?
Mhm.
He's not going into it for a very literal spiritual reason, right? He's
Yep.
not, or anything else. So it's interesting how I think that is one of the. I mean, it's kind of a superficial read, but it's a read nonetheless. How interesting his character is, precisely specifically because we think he's there exploiting the situation. I don't mean in a morally bad way, just exploiting the situation, right? Of smuggling
Yeah.
these items out of it, of being paid to take people in and out of it, right? Evading the government, right? A very rogue figure. And yet this becomes so much more philosophical, right?
Mhm.
Than his stance on any one thing, right? Because it is very much, as you were saying before, about his relationship to this ambiguity, to the zone, right? Um, it's or even in belief itself. I think one of the few lines of dialogue that were kept really succinctly between, obviously, now when I'm watching the movie, I'm watching it with English subtitles,
Mhm.
which
Yep.
themselves are translations, and same for the book, the English translation. I'm presuming you don't read Russian,
I don't know.
so
Not yet.
no, no, no. You're probably reading the same thing, but it's interesting because yeah, I think one of the few things earlier on in both the movie and the movie certainly, I forget when in the book this was, but they're talking about um, talking about what he doesn't believe in, right? That there's no such thing as you know aliens. Maybe it's not him. Sorry, maybe I'm thinking of someone else. Anyways, people say that that there's no aliens, there's no telepathy, there's no time travel, right?
Yep.
This is very grounded in a very empirical sense of what the film is, and or sorry, of what they're going for, what he's going for. But it's all very much tested, right? To the extent of what they can believe, and certainly what the zone does and imposes on them. You know,
Hmm.
uh, remind me, how much does the theme of, or more of a question for you actually than a question for you than a question about the book. Um, how do you think desire, like the concept of desire, fit into the book? Because obviously it's a very guiding idea um, in the zone and especially in the room that they're ultimately going towards, this
Yeah.
unseen room.
Yeah. Yeah. I
But
think in the film. Hmm.
in the film, certainly. But yeah, what are your thoughts on it? On their different desires and how it relates to how the zone affects that or can.
It's one of those elements that you kind of see it. I think we briefly touched on it as well in a ways that we're primarily seeing things from Red's perspective, and he really does not desire anything. He's surrounded by people that desire so much. They desire greed, they desire a perfect life. You have the character of Burbridge, this older stalker that has been going through the zone many, many times, who has a son who's been hoping for a better life by also screwing a lot of the people around him and leading them to certain death and things like that. I think they call him the Vulture. I also like that element that every single stalker gets a nickname that's related to who they are and how they behave coming in and out of the zone. So you have the Vulture because Vulture pecks off of dead bodies, but Red always stays Red. He never really changes. He never really has a thing for himself outside of being a stalker, outside of being himself. So he himself does not really have any desires, which is tragic. Like the ending basically feels in the book feels like him realizing that he really doesn't have a purpose in life. That's how I read it, at least, because you have the wife is called Guta, Guta Schuhart. She's someone that desires a family, that desires having a husband, having someone there to support her and the child. She's also a very interesting character, strong character. Maybe she's having a tryst with his friend. We don't
Mm.
know. It's kept a bit ambiguous. Um, but even then, like Red does not really desire having a family. He just accidentally gets her pregnant and you know, continues the relationship because of that. He likes her. But when it gets to the point, that's how I saw it, at least when it comes to desire, is that ultimately the only thing he really desired was going to the zone.
Hmm.
So even when his face is him and Anthony, I think it was called, like the kid of the vulture with whom he's going through the zone at the end, finding this golden sphere that's going to give you what your heart desires, what you really want. He ends up repeating what this kid wanted, basically, for everyone to be happy and to be free, um, which is a strong statement, very naive, maybe, very futile, you could say, but it's not even his own desire. I really think he was an aimless man, not even necessarily aimless, but for me, it also fits into this element of exploitation of labor that's present in the book. Um,
Mm.
because it's something that I'm witnessing constantly in life, probably relatable to you as well. We're both under 30 years old, but we always have this constant push to be something in life, to have goals, to have a path that you can follow, that you have to figure out before a specific age, and it's a lot of pressure. And so I've also see in a very interesting way how Red does not want to fit into any of those boxes. He's going his own way, he's following his own wants more than needs, and just surviving. And that's what he really wants to do. And he really doesn't have any desire for anything. Um, yeah, I don't even know if this answers your question in
No,
any
I
way.
no, I no, I think it absolutely does. Right? I mean, I don't think it's a contrarian idea to say that when Red, and sorry, having seen the movie so many times, I just think of
Mhm.
him as Stalker because in the movies that they're just called by their various occupations.
Yeah, I
Stalk
always picture the bald Alexander Kaidanovsky. That's what I always
exactly,
picture. I don't picture
exactly.
a red-headed guy
Right,
prone to
right,
violence and drunk.
R- right. Yeah, this like a bad mannered like gangster character,
Yeah.
right? But there is something to be said about how well, of course, the part of the zone, of course, is going to give you what you desire. Well, you don't know that you desire because it's such an inner, subconscious desire, right? And for him, it's not necessary. It may not necessarily be, you know, riches or a lovely wife or a happy family or fame or any of these big abstract things.
Hmm.
It's to know himself much better, right? And be much more grounded in himself, right? Not just necessarily living day to day, or rather understanding himself as living very day to day. Um, exploiting the zone, right, for its pieces, you know, but just having a much more grounded sense. So there is something to be said about how what the zone gives you isn't necessarily a positive, happy thing, right?
Hmm.
And I think maybe that's an instance of what it is too. Um, and of course, we see, his own children being mutated, right? This is much more, sorry, about his kid. This is much more explicit in the book, right? Whereas in the movie, of course, it just ends with this instance of telepathy.
Hmm.
Um, I will say that I think I view it as having a positive ending in this sense, right? Only because, well, he understands himself much better, and obviously he's not in trouble and no one died in the zone, right?
Yep.
So these things that they were hoping to avoid never happened. So I don't know if that's a good, but it's a lack of bad, right? But also, which may be good in
It's
itself.
not terrible.
Right, right. I mean, it's not like the Stalker video games where, it's, the monsters get you and then you die.
Hmm.
It's game over, right? So, yeah, I think there is something very positive in the sense that he becomes a very, enlightened figure in this sense. And people don't expect this on the job, right? Going back to what you were saying, I do absolutely relate to that. I mean, the whole reason I'm working on my master's degree at 27 is because my bachelor's in film studies could couldn't get me anywhere. But then again, not that I didn't enjoy my 4 years of you know people with PhDs putting on a Bergman movie, pointing at the screen and saying, "This is a good movie."
It was
You know,
useful for something, kind of.
yes, yes. It was useful for working at the art house theater in Seattle, making minimum wage than the chain theater. Okay, now I'm just being a bit bitchy. But the point goes is yeah, no, I absolutely understand that, Uh and neither of us are getting younger, right? So, we're going to hit 30
Hmm.
and then 40 is going to hit a lot sooner than 30 did from when we were 20 and on, right?
Yep. Yep.
So, yes, I do know what you mean.
Yeah, which is also kind of part of the surprising element for me in the book is that you do have those jumps in time. It doesn't go that drastic, but still I think in the first chapter, Red is only 23, 24, something like that.
Right,
And it explicitly says something like Redrick Schuhart, age 23, single. And then the next time, second chapter is age 28, married. He has a kid already, you know. And at the end of the book, he's 31, 32. It's been multiple years in prison. So there is
right,
this element also of the passage of time, the inevitability of it, the surprisingly again an element that's been a constant in sci-fi that was very prescient back then. Of course, it's happened many times throughout history, but labor, the way it changes. They mentioned that they have more machines now taking over the jobs. They don't need stalkers anymore. They have them going in the zone to find those relics, and they're doing a worse job. There is this
right,
this element of commentary that, you know, like so many things, ages very gracefully because humanity will never really change at its core. We can have books from 2,000 years ago that are still relatable to today. So there is this element, but yeah,
I
I
mean, well, in the age of people getting laid off for AI, of
yeah.
of a non-human entity taking their job, it's all very funny.
Yeah, and you have
And
this
not even
element also of like all of the government officials that do not care about the human element. They only care about results, about having those trinkets and trying to
Mhm.
understand them in a way that feels. I was reading some people's thoughts on the movie. Sorry, on the story of the book, of how it can also be related to the whole idea of the roadside picnic. You know, it's just there was no idea behind the aliens. They just, you know, dropped shit off because they were just passing by, the same way you would leave some food or a tin can or whatever in nature, and then the wild animals show up and don't know what to do with them because they're completely alien objects. And it's the same way with the scientists here, that they just find something and are trying to figure out how it works, but for us it's meaningless. um it's,
Right.
yeah,
No, yeah,
interesting.
I mean, I think that is ultimately one of the most beautiful motifs of the book.
Hmm.
Um, that's very much explained, right? It very much is, explained why the title is what it is in the book, and they have this whole
Surprisingly
discussion,
explicit. I thought it was going to be more hidden or
like a
metaphorical. Yeah, I was not expecting it to be just like blunt. You get to halfway through the
like an
book and you have
epilogue.
a dialogue. I
Oh, sure,
was
like
like,
an
oh, that's the
epilogue with some
title.
poems. Sorry, we're talking over each other. I was just gonna say like a epilogue of like a poetic picnic scene where it's like
Mm,
okay, it's a little on the nose, but that's sweet, right? Where
yeah.
here, the idea of a roadside picnic or a picnic in general is very literal, right? Which is funny because yeah, to them again, the alien, it's just a holiday. It's just they're doing it on accident, right? There is no grand meaning behind this. This isn't a gift to people. This isn't like 2001: A Space Odyssey, the book or the
Trying to
movie.
make contact or
Right,
see if we are
right,
intelligent enough to understand them. And yeah.
exactly. This isn't some grand puzzle, right? This isn't Arrival with language games in that movie, right? It's much more abstracted, which is funny because again, if that's true, and this is just these aliens trash, then people are having these profound, spiritual existential beliefs over trash and littering. What amounts to that? But I mean, this is kind of known, right? If aliens were to visit Earth, um, many people have speculated to the point that feels very obviously true. People around the world would have a lot of spiritual problems with that.
Hmm.
No religious text, right, makes reference of aliens, coming to Earth, right? Um, so questioning of faith up to and even reality and physics itself. That's something to consider.
This
Hey
is
Nick,
for people that want. If you, I don't know if you've seen Disclosure Day, the Spielberg
I,
film.
I have not.
It actually touches on this, which is interesting. There is this element of like faith and belief in aliens and how the two can connect. So I would maybe, I mean, I was not a fan of the movie for multiple reasons, but that was one of the most interesting elements in it. So for you and listeners as well, yeah, maybe check it out. It might give you something that you were not expecting in that sense.
Certainly, certainly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you have a passage or quote from the book written down that particularly stood out to you? That's one of your favorite passages, favorite moments, anything like that that you would like to share?
Um, Let me look back at the book. Why don't you go first?
I think I can go first. As I mentioned before, I came very close with picking actually the last monologue of Red just before he maybe dies. That's my theory. I think the hard cut after he stops speaking, saying the same things that Anthony, the guy that just died, also shouted out before being evaporated by the golden sphere, which also is not very much golden. And I love all those elements of like the the sphere itself built up its own mythology, its own legend that became this magical thing that maybe has no real meaning or no real purpose and that does absolutely nothing. But people need that hope and need this dream. It reminded me of like El Dorado and all of those magical places, Atlantis. You know, people are always looking for something more, for something higher, for something magical, for something that feels bigger than just, what life is. But there is a beauty in the simplicity of life. Anyway, I'm getting lost here. My quote comes from the
Fine.
conversation that the professor has with Noonan. And the quote says, "The hypothesis of God, for instance, gives an incomparably absolute opportunity to understand everything and know absolutely nothing. Give men an extremely simplified system of the world and explain every phenomenon away on the basis of that system. An approach like that doesn't require any knowledge, just a few memorized formulas plus so called intuition and so called common sense." Again, for me, it's this idea of faith and belief and how everyone here kind of clings on to it. You also mentioned it briefly earlier. Um, these aliens are almost a new form of god if they can exist, if they even exist. It's the same thing, it's the same concept. In the olden times they thought there was Mount Olympus, and Zeus was throwing lightning on the ground and Poseidon was controlling the seas. It's not that different. The moment you find scientific understanding is the moment all of those beliefs, all those faiths kind of collapse, and it turns everything also more trivial, you could say. Life itself can be trivialized immensely, and I think the entire back and forth that they have is very compelling.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's interesting that you bring up the idea of including in your quote, with your quote, the idea of faith being tested by this alien presence
Hmm.
in the zone and this um, mythologization. I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
This myth making around the golden sphere of this idea, where it becomes more than just alien technology possessing capabilities which we don't really know, right?
Hmm.
So it becomes more than just a scientific inquiry there. It becomes a spiritual journey into knowing and knowledge itself. I did just pull up this quote from the book, which I just want to read real quick because it ties into this directly. Uh, it goes, "Xenology is an unnatural mixture of science fiction and formal logic. At its core is a flawed assumption that an alien race would be psychologically human." Now, real quick, it's interesting, of course, for Strugatsky brothers to write just the phrase science fiction into it, because it feels very meta, right?
Yep, yep, yep.
But of course, at the same time, um, to call it science fiction is, well, I guess it's the closest approximation of what it is. Now, the Strugatsky brothers, I haven't read anything else by them, but I do
Me
know that
neither.
they primarily worked in this realm of science fiction, of almost a very commentary heavy pulp stuff. I don't want to call them a pulp writer because again, that feels incorrect, right?
Yeah, they had many problems with censor as well. Apparently, funnily enough, this was one of the easiest books for them to get approved with just very minor changes. But then I think they
Interesting.
were able to get reinstated in future editions after the collapse of the USSR or SSR. Um, yeah,
Interesting. Interesting. I didn't know that.
maybe the setting as well helps because it's technically somewhere in the United States. Um,
Right. Yeah, or just some English speaking place, right? Whether
yeah.
it's England or the US or Canada. Yeah, which is interesting, right? Why this have to be so alien to Russia at the time? Um, I mean, obviously not just for the censorship reasons, but I think for their largely Russian readership too. Of
Mhm.
course, the idea of something that is not just literally far away, but not, for lack of a better word, exotic, but distant and unknowable, right? Because obviously the Russian people weren't ignorant of America and life there. But again, going back to this idea of hypernormalization, right? Having to think and act that America was or was not something that it very much was. And then relating that to Russia itself, of life in Russia, of how that was, right?
Yeah.
So it is very much commentary on Russia itself through this fictionalized, maybe American place, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter if it's America or England or Canada or some other English speaking place, you know. But but yeah, the idea of xenology in that quote, um, it's funny because I'm reminded of how this movie had come up in my own work on my time. I'm sure you've come across the name Kenji Surutori in, my Instagram and my writings.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, the guy works and a lot of my own projects, outside of academia, are with what he regards as xenopoetry, which is very much what it sounds like, but not. It can be summarized into the idea of understandings of literature and poetry through this alien lens, right?
Hmm.
Of this distant non-human idea, of writing for non-human perspective, but also non-human writing, right? So we can assume we can imagine this as um, contextualizing computer code into a poetic sense, or alien languages, right? Fictional languages and poetry within them. One of the more famous examples is called the Xenotext, in which bacteria are inscribed with poetry.
Oh,
Their
okay.
DNA is inscribed with this, so that as their colonies, these bacteria colonies grow, they form actual lines of poetry in their bodies or in the colony. It's very interesting, right?
It's very fascinating. Yeah.
Yes. So in a xenological sense or a xenopoetic sense, um, we can imagine the idea of the zone, the golden sphere, right? Of again this human imposition on something it doesn't understand. And there's no real in the book or the movie. There's no real mention of some distant future where they do come to understand this,
Hmm.
right? Because it's all about their lack of comprehension, of their being unable to participate in its interpretation.
Yep.
So, which just reflects the human back onto itself. Which, going back to our main protagonist, Red, it's funny because, in all of his time being a stalker, uh, it comes to give him the sense of real human understanding of himself and perhaps this nihilism, right? But an informed nihilism of himself, where he does have a bit of a spiritual collapse, right? A very spiritual battle of just how much or how very little any of this matters to him, right?
Yeah.
Which of course is also mirrored in one of the last scenes in the movie, second to last scene, I believe, when he's breaking down crying in front of his wife. In the book, it's interesting because going back to the idea of it being that quote, right, that an alien race would be psychologically human. It's funny because people keep trying to impose human ideas on these aliens, right?
Hmm.
Are they another race that we could hypothetically empathize with, or some other being with its own goals that we can compare to humans? Are they spiritual beings? Are they gods? Or are they beyond the relationship that humans have to spirituality? Whatever they may be, the fact that they're factored in and comprehended not just literally by humans, but within these human frames of reference, ultimately goes in circles, right? And proves just how futile a lot of this is. Um, which I think goes back to not just these. Uh, I think does to go back to sorry to go back to the character of Red does ultimately prove or is part of why he has this this breakdown and views everything he's doing as very pointless, because perhaps it is, if only because he can't comprehend it.
Yeah.
And then the flip side of that, of course, that these alien beings, this force, um, would have a very different interpretation, even if it is very literally just of a roadside picnic analogy, right? Of
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
not having thought of it, right? Let alone having had some big meaning behind it.
Hmm. Yeah. And that's ultimately the beauty of how the novel approaches it, is that you get no answers. They could have easily found some way of rationalizing it or explain it if they wanted, but then that would remove so much of what makes the book what it is. So I was very also saddened by the ending of it in a way.
Mm.
It feels so tragic and so harsh. Also to see this long, treacherous journey to the Golden Sphere, and then it's almost all for nothing. In a way, it's inevitable, you could say, um, of an ending, which also is a good moment to then transition fully into the movie of Tarkovsky, which we already mentioned many, many times, of course, released in 1979. Written, also co-written by Tarkovsky with the Strugatsky brothers, starring Alexander Kaidanovsky, Anatoly Solonitsyn, Nikolai Renko, and Aliza Freundlich. Um, I can go first for this one. This was
Sure.
only my second time actually watching the film. The first time was over 8 years ago, around 8 years ago, um, when I was fully into my catch up era of cinema. I just studied
Mm.
history of cinema in 2017, and it opened up the world to me. So then I created this long list of like 100 movies that I was going to watch in 2 months, of like all those classics I've always wanted to see, I've always heard about, but I never got to watch. And I'm pretty sure I watched Stalker right when I was burning out. So watching, and I'd already seen and loved Mirror, so I was not new to Tarkovsky's style back then. But yeah, it was too much. I remember I was just bored to tears by it. But I always told myself, like, one day I'm gonna rewatch it and I will be able to appreciate it. One day it will come. One day it will come. The day came in preparation for this podcast. I was eagerly anticipating this, primarily to rewatch Stalker with a proper adult brain, not a 20 year
Mhm.
old's brain. And I have to say, I found it absolutely beautiful. I'm fully on the Stalker wavelength now. It's poetic and philosophical in the way that only Tarkovsky could do. The tracking shots, those dialogues, the simplicity of it all, that's very deceiving. It feels like a movie that anyone could make in a way. Just just like the way it's shot and presented feels simple, but it's so intricate, so complicated, with terrible history of making it, where they lost the first half of the movies they were shooting it, and then we had problems with censors and whatever, so you had to reshoot the whole movie essentially. Primarily the second half, from what I get, which is also why the movie's weirdly split. After 1 hour, where you get like part two, Stalker, and the camera looks different. Messy, messy, messy production. Last movie he made in the Soviet Union before he was exiled. Um, Kind of funny that the movie had more troubles than the book, even though I would have expected the opposite, to be honest, considering the content. But, you know, he was a threat to the Soviet Union back then with his art. I'm very curious, Alden, your
Yes.
history with this film then, because you mentioned you are we're I think we're both Tarkovsky fans by now, but what was it like watching it the first time then?
Oh, sure. I I must have been about the same age that you were, about 20, but I also think I would have been younger. I can't It's weird. As I was saying to you before we started recording, I feel like I've seen this more than I've logged on Letterboxd, certainly.
Yeah,
I mean, I know it's been years, right? I think the last time I watched it in full was required viewing for a film class I did in my undergrad,
nice.
and I've since graduating, I've watched the handful of Tarkovsky films that I hadn't seen um, since then, which were Nostalgia and Mirror, I believe. Yeah, those two. But yeah, my first time, it's weird because I want to say it would have been even as far back as in high school, because I had a phase where I was just I had friends who were much smarter and much more interesting than me, and who would get me into these kind of movies, right? So in high school, I watched everything from Enter the Void by
Oh,
Gaspar Noé to Salo, and and I love them both. Well, maybe not Salo so much at the time. I do love it now, but that's for a different.
different
Oh
podcast.
God, I was going to say that'd be a great. I'd love to see your episode on that. Or
I
have the
have
movie.
I have read the book by Marquis de Sade, so I'm open to do it.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. But yeah. Anyways, talking about 120 Days of Sodomy. I thought Stalker was great, but I did not get it at the time.
Hmm.
I want to say I slowly got it more and more as I watched it. So this time, when I watched it again, last night would have been either the third or fourth time, and I feel like I finally got it even more. And what's interesting is that in watching it, before even talking about the plot and interpretations and the beauty of it all, there's so many iconic shots in it, right?
Oh God, yeah.
I mean, just seeing, screen grabs of it online, stills of it, artwork made from it for various posters, the Criterion packaging, all this. So I feel like even if it has been a few years since I've seen it last, before last night, I feel like I've still watched it in a way, or like it's been part of my life. And this is effectively true. I mean, I can't say well, first off, I haven't played the video game. So it's not like I've been a part of me in that way.
Yeah.
But there's still nothing really like it. Um, Going to your point about the troubled production of it all, it's funny because in Tarkovsky movies, I think we assume a very clean, like very smooth atmosphere, right? That's very easy, like gliding across water kind of experience. Stalker has some edges to it, which I don't know if they're intentional or not. I would presume maybe they're not. But there's some shots that are a bit more shaky than they should be, right?
Hmm.
Some lighting things for sure, but I think this vague edginess to it, besides them, kind of running out of money or having to reshoot a lot of it halfway through, I think this adds something, right?
Hmm.
Because we don't really talk about a danger in the movie, right? There's no monster. unlike in the video games. There's no monster in the zone, right? The only mention of it, well, the closest thing to some animal being there is the dog that comes back
The sign of
repeatedly.
life, the only sign of life.
Exactly. And then, very early on, I think in the first scene, right when the film switches to color,
Hmm.
um, is we hear this kind of wolf howling in the distance. And then they talk about, if other people live there or other animals can live there. Because we don't, again, besides that one dog, there's no signs of life at all. This is a part of the production, even. I watched a lot of the, production documentaries,
Mm.
videos that they have on the Criterion channel last night. And he being Tarkovsky, obviously, was so adamant about this that there's a certain scene in a field where the area already looks abandoned, right? This is very high, untouched grass and woodlands kind of area. Um, some yellow flowers, like some dandelions, had just started to bloom, and he wanted people to go, like the production people, to go out and pluck every single one, so there wouldn't be any yellow in the fields. Which is funny because they also have to make it look like it's untouched. So they're just like tiptoeing around this area.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
right before they were going to shoot, he goes to a set decorator and he says, "It feels like they've been here." It's like, well, what the fuck does that mean? Anyways,
He was
not gonna.
special. Don't judge. Let him cook, as they say.
No, no, very obviously, very much so,
Um,
very much so. But yeah, sorry, I could talk endlessly about this movie.
thank you.
To go, yes, to go back to the first point about my first time watching it, I knew the first and also the second time I watched it that it would be a part of my life, right? These are
Mm,
films I'm going to come back to, right? Where the language stays fresh and the ideas stay interesting, largely because of these very alien notions of them being based in the inhuman, right?
hmm.
So it's not like there's something to directly compare it to, let alone get tired of.
Yeah.
So uh, I knew first and second time I watched it that I returned to it, and I certainly will. I mean, there's no Tarkovsky movie I think I outright dislike in any
Me
way.
neither. Me neither. Would you say this is
I
your
mean,
favorite of his? Maybe.
oh god, well, I think it's the one I've seen the most.
Mm.
If I had to pick a favorite, it's a toss up between nostalgia and the sacrifice.
Oh,
But I
okay.
think it's weird though because I've seen the sacrifice only once, but part of me still I think about that movie the most.
Okay.
And I have a letterbox favorite movies list like you do, and I only allow myself to pick one per director, and I think that's the one I chose.
That's a nice challenge. That's a nice challenge.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. What was you told me your first time watching it,
Yep.
but you recently came back to it, as in the other day.
Hmm.
You rewatched it, and it clicked for you, and it meant so much more for you. Um, why do you think that was? But also, how do you think of Stalker and Tarkovsky's, over of movies? Like, how do you think it like fits in? Well, and how you relate to everyone that he's done that you've seen.
Yeah. I will start with this last question first. It has grown in appreciation, definitely. I'm still very much closely attached to both Mirror and Nostalgia or Nostalgia. I always forget if it's supposed to be Italian or not, the title. Um, which is weird considering that I watched them when I was the youngest, but they hit me the hardest at that point. But there is something about the melancholy and looking back at the past of those films that particularly attracts me. I'm someone that's very fascinated by those ideas of melancholy, nostalgia itself, of course. Um, but Stalker, similarly to Solaris as well, which was another movie I enjoyed but didn't care that much about. I think rewatching them helped because they are both, especially Stalker, very meditative pieces that require a level of focus and attention that you just cannot have if you are for whatever reason, just you don't have that energy, mental capacity, energy, immaturity, even, to be perfectly honest. And I think there is something very beguiling about, oh, we're going to watch a sci-fi film. Even if it's a Tarkovsky film, it's still science fiction. um, but here it's even more stripped back than Solaris was. um, so I think why the reason why it worked better for me now is that not only did I have better expectations of what it was going to be, that helps, but I was just generally in a better mindset to watch it and appreciate it and be on its wavelength. Like I waited for the right day where I had the mental capacity to focus on it and just be enthralled by it. I love that this is the movie where Tarkovsky has the quote about saying, the beginning of the movie has to be slow so that if people get into the wrong theater, they have the time to leave and be like, this movie's not for me before the actual action starts. It's like, yep,
That's
yeah,
right. That's right.
that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. That's cheeky, but he has a point, right? Um, so I was the kind of person I probably would have left back 8 years ago, but it's also similar to the book in a way. It touches on those ideas of desires and just searching for meaning, searching for happiness, for whatever you really want, that plays into a feeling of mortality that I've been feeling quite strongly over the past couple of years. Time passing and moving forward. And again, then to bring it back to your last question, is also how I see it with his over. He's always been playing with time. He talks about sculpting in time a lot. I've read the book, which is an incredible read. And you have this feeling of, just time going by and trying to find meaning in a way. I think this was made after Mirror, right? I think Mirror was a movie that came before this one. Um, and it kind of plays, as the flip side of that. It feels like they're in the same sets too. It feels like the same area where they shot Mirror, this decadent nature taking over man-made structures. I like that they don't go full Hollywood with the effects. There's nothing honestly that's particularly um, marvelous on a purely effects level. They don't even try. Everything is just implied. It's a lot of people crouching and throwing darts and bolts on the ground to see if it's safe or not to proceed. The book is way more, like you mentioned, like very, very genre heavy. It goes for gore, it goes for violence, but there's none of that here in the zone. And I like it for that. I like the restraint, and I like how it builds fear of the unknown into the viewers. So then lead you to those iconic shots that you mentioned. I think especially that room with the sand dunes. For me, that's when someone says Stalker, the movie, that's like the first image in my mind. It's like the image from this film. Um, yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I think we could spend hours also just talking about Stalker as its own as its own movie, and its place into Tarkovsky's filmography. But I'm curious, how do because we both mentioned it already, they share very little similarities, the book and the film, despite being written by the same authors of the novel. Um, how do you feel the film compares in terms of a companion piece of sorts, of thematically, not so much narratively because there's very little there, but thematically, do you think they complement each other maybe, or do they stand alone fully?
I think that the movie essentially just uh, it feels like it's really just a commentary on, or not a commentary on, it's just an extension of the idea of the zone as a motif, right?
Hmm.
So they're just different avenues for exploring this. As I was saying earlier, right, the idea of, I think this might have been before we started recording, but in comparing it to, say, Krasnorka's, that guy, Laszlo Krasnorka's books, in comparing them to Bellatar films, you realize that there is obviously a very big experiential difference
Hmm.
between a movie and the book. hypothetically, right, Roadside Picnic could have been adapted into a much faster, much more genre heavy movie. I mean, any director making a much more faithful adaptation of the novel, let alone Tarkovsky, um, it feels silly compared to the movie as it stands. And it's funny. I'm actually pulling up some still images from the video game because I've just realized in talking about this that I've never actually seen what the video game looks like.
Okay.
And same difference, right? This feels much more. I mean, this obviously is a first-person shooter, deals with Chernobyl and science fiction, monsters, and all this.
Yep.
So I think we have to remember that out of all of this, again, the soul of it isn't. I almost want to say that the heart of it isn't even the plot and how these various characters relate. How they engage with the narrative arc and how they come back to themselves and how they learn about themselves and the friends they made on the way and all this.
Tarkovsky's
Um,
Wizard of Oz.
yes,
Kind of. In a way.
exactly. Oh, honestly, yeah. Yeah, it almost feels just a way of exploring the idea of the zone
Mhm.
and these alien ways of framing understanding, of framing knowledge and being, you know.
Yes.
And I think the film does that well. I'm gonna say right now that if I had to pick between the movie and the book, just general preference, it would absolutely be the movie. But I think that's also because it explores so much that the book doesn't, in a sense, right? It it's much more meditative. You get the idea that these ideas are much bigger
Hmm.
um, than these everyday kind of banal, problems. Of this guy's, of Red's, perhaps loveless marriage, and people exploiting the zone for financial reasons, right?
Yes.
It becomes so much bigger, more beautiful, more spiritual, let alone, obviously, because Tarkovsky is slowing everything down so much.
Yeah.
Also, another thing, and you were saying earlier that Tarkovsky starts his movies very slow, so that he's joking, of course, when he says that, so people know that they uh, know if they've been to the wrong movie or not. It's funny because I'm reminded of two things immediately. Reminded of Abbas Kiarostami thinking that it's perfectly fine if people sleep in his movies
Hmm.
or sleep in movies, period. Um, saying that he loves it when he gets to sleep in a movie, which is understandable. Some of the best naps I've ever had have been in movie theaters. But beyond that,
Same.
exactly, yeah. But I'm also reminded of Scott Barley's notes on film, where
Mm.
he says that in the very beginning of a movie, you do have to hold the audience's hand, right, before you can let go. Because eventually they can swim out. He uses the metaphor of swimming and going out to a body of water. But, eventually into the film, or in this metaphorical body of water, the audience can swim out on their own and be in the soul, in the midst of the movie on their own. And you don't need to explain it to them, let alone give them guidance, right? Which is interesting because in these different viewings of Stalker over the years, it almost feels like I'm watching. Well, obviously, I'm watching the same movie, the same order of scenes and the same times,
Hmm.
whatnot. Literally the same movie, but it feels very different. Not just because I focus on different things or I've gotten older, but for how essentially simple the movie is. It's still very rich, right? Visually rich, sonically rich. Um, yeah, I mean,
Philosophically,
yes, yes,
intellectually.
yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I notice more things every time, and I notice different things every time. You know,
Hmm.
for example, even just the tanks. somehow I didn't notice that before. You know, in the movie where there's this extensive like pan scene where it's panning over a field, and there's these like decrepit tanks with moss covering them.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, I never even noticed that before. And that's just one superficial example. But
This is a movie I
I'm
would
always
say, by the way, it's a movie I would love to watch in the cinema because so far I've only seen it on the small screen. I imagine you did the same, right?
yeah, yeah. I
I'd
mean,
love to see it on the big screen and just get fully
yeah. I
immersed in those images.
the closest to a big screen I've ever seen Stalker on was when it was assigned during my undergraduate years, and you know, the lecture hall we got to see it on the screen there. It's
Yeah.
kind of a theater screening room, which is lovely. Not a huge screen, but certainly bigger than any TV I've ever owned. But even just watching it on my own last night on my own about 50-inch TV, you still get the sense. Sorry, 120 centimeters or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you know, you get the idea of just how massive it is. You
Mhm.
know, um, though I have seen Solaris in the theater before. Funny
Oh,
enough,
nice.
yeah. It was this theater in Seattle doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. It was an art house theater called The Grand Illusion. That is a reference to the movie of the same name. But yeah, I watched it there and it was wonderful. The unfortunate thing is that, you know, Solaris, like every Tarkovsky movie, is a bit quiet, right?
Yeah.
And you never notice the architecture of a movie theater in a bad way until I never noticed it until I went here. What I mean by that is that the back of the theater, like just behind the screen, is the street and like an intersection,
Oh
so you can just
no.
hear like cars honking and you know trucks going by,
Oh,
which is almost funny in a way. But then you know, but then the movie keeps going on for another 2.5 hours.
takes you out. Takes you out quite
It
strongly, I
does, yes,
imagine. Um,
yes. But I'm sure I'll get back to it again. I mean, it's still a been talking for a while here, but yeah, no, I'd love to see it again. I'd love to watch it again, certainly.
I was fascinated. The main question I had while reading the book was, why did Tarkovsky adapt it? Like, you get into the conversation with the professor, and I was thinking, okay, I get this is interesting, but this is not what the movie is about. Like, what caught his attention? And then the moment the golden sphere is introduced, which is, I want to say, it's actually in the second to last chapter, so it's an element that's not even really hinted at earlier in the novel. It's very much in the second half of it that is even brought up. That's when it kind of clicks for me, and I realized, like, oh, I can picture Tarkovsky kind of reading this genre book, high quality genre book, but still, commercial story primarily, um, and seeing this idea of the golden sphere being granted all the desires and just being really enthralled by it. And that felt like the
Mm-hmm.
genesis of his idea of how to then potentially adapt the movie. Of course, took many years to make, but just on a on a emotional level, that's what it felt like. Um, Reading it, and honestly, all of the conversations and discussions about life and humanity, and again, similar themes that are present in the book, but like you said, it just goes to town on them. He fully embraces them. Happiness, what it means to be happy, what it means to desire something, to want something, to need something. What's our purpose in life in a grander scale, but also in a micro scale. Um, it's so thoughtful, thought provoking, and then again, ambiguous and open, that truly everyone can take something different out of this film. Um, for me, it kind of made me feel hopeful about just life in general, because sometimes we can get very preoccupied with grander ideas in a way that actually take us away from the reality of living in the present in a way. So especially the final scene that the stalker has with his wife, and then the monologue that she gives are truly lovely moments of humanity that I think are always found in Tarkovsky's body of work, especially as you get towards the end of the stories. He always manages to have those profound um, moments, and it felt very hopeful in a way. How did you feel? Was there anything in particular that you would say was like your reading favorite part or something like that of the movie that really touched you?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I have two. I'll say the second place one first, which is when they're crossing over and they're driving over to the zone, right?
Hmm.
And they're going past these military checkpoints. There is something first off that I'm going to be analytical and academic first, and then I'm going to be fun about it. But obviously reminds me a lot of the Gulag, right? And it feels very much commentary on these things, right? With barbed wire and the security
Everybody's
of it all.
armed.
Yes, but there's also something so genuinely thrilling. Like they're not working with much, right? But it feels like they're working with a lot, right?
Hmm.
These huge trains and the car driving over the train tracks. When again, these scenes are it's not that fast, and these are still long takes. Uh, but there's this shot where the car is at an angle going down the train tracks, where the back wheels are at like an angle to the front, where it just feels like they're like skidding, like Akira style, like the
So
motorcycle from Akira.
dangerous.
I know, but that alone, it's weird because obviously there's still the beauty in the film, and yet it almost doesn't feel like anything else in Tarkovsky. I mean, I think that first off, it's the only part of a Tarkovsky movie where I think there's any like imminent danger. You know, it's the only. There's no like shootout scenes in his movies, right? So it feels almost uncharacteristic to see a machine gun
People
and then
getting
running
fired
away.
at. There's a chase basically through the streets, but it's all like plays like Scooby Doo on slow motion. There's
No,
one car
exactly,
goes right,
exactly.
the other comes out of the other side. They're circling around each other.
Right, right. And I know it's maybe a little silly to approach a movie like Stalker and say that, oh, my favorite movie was, or my favorite part was the chase scene. But no, I think there's something genuinely unique to it because again, he's
Hmm.
not working with much, in the shot or let alone, the materiality of the production. But it's way more thrilling than I think a lot of movies of the same caliber. And you really do get this idea that there's actually a sense of danger and hurry to it, right?
And scale as
And it
well. It
stands in
feels
such
massive.
sharp, yeah, and it feels so like sudden
Hmm.
and such sharp contrast to everything around it, let alone before. I mean, the leading up to to those scenes are very slow compared to after, of course. So yeah, no, I love that. My favorite scene would actually kind of an odd answer would probably be the very last scene where his kid, who we never hear about or learn much about at all in the movie, is using telekinesis. They're pushing
Hmm.
cups off a table, and I say that because I would argue that I would argue that there's actually something we can glean from that. There actually is a positive ending to the movie, right? I mean, none of the three main characters of these three heroes in the movie, none of them get what they want, right? It's all a very like devastatingly underwhelming ending for them,
Hmm.
especially for Red or just Stalker in the movie. but we do get the idea, and of course, it's the closest reference we get to the kid being, mutated by the zone. But I think there is something to it where, well, we see a few things in that, right? We see that maybe there is some hope for this kid, for the future, and for his immediate family. Because if he did get his, well, sorry, let me backtrack. We never learned that the kid is mutated or affected by the zone in any way before then, right? Like how in the book it's much more detailed.
Yeah, I think they only say maybe something about her being crippled, that she cannot walk, or something like that.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, of course, the kid isn't crippled in the movie, but uh, but them being so affected by the zone that they can do telepathy, I think is it's interesting because, well, one, that ties back to dialogue earlier on, where the writer character, I mean, he literally says that that the universe has very hard rules, that telepathy does not exist, aliens don't exist. Where he's being very empirical and kind of atheist about it,
Yep.
right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, and then, of course, aliens are almost never mentioned or discussed in the movie. But telepathy is much more interesting here, if only because it shows just, well, I think it's a great inclusion of the child characters, right? Because children in Tarkovsky's movies, especially his later movies, are used much more as like a spiritual figure, right?
A pure
Where it's not,
innocence.
where it's not just that, but there is like a very quiet wisdom to these kids, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and I think there's something just really beautiful. It's also interesting because I think the first couple times I watched it, watching these cups, glide across the table, I know it's like a very easy trick in special effects to potentially do that, right? You put magnets in the cups or something, and then there's someone under the table. But when I think I first watched it, genuinely it genuinely wowed me,
Hmm.
because obviously being in the 70s, there's no green screen, there's no CGI, so very impressive. I thought it was like genuinely jarring.
And
Um,
considering what happened before in the movie, it feels major. Or if you had
yeah,
anything that Red experiences in the book of, like, the heat wave and the burning and the hell slime and all of those, or sci-fi elements, it would not be that impactful. But then for Tarkovsky, it's kind of like the chase you mentioned before. I think it feels major considering the pace of the movie and how
right.
everything is building. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So yeah, that's what comes to mind for me. In terms of favorite scenes, if I had to pick some.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I,
You know what we haven't discussed? How dangerous the movie was for the actors.
yeah, yep, yep, yep. Because they were working. Well, I said, remind me. Maybe you remember better the actual locations they shot in.
They were in, well, they weren't in Russia. They were in Estonia,
Hmm.
actually, for the shooting of the movie, and they were in a very deeply polluted with nuclear waste, but also a lot of chemical waste in the area, which you do see kind of in the later scenes when they're by the room, and they have the bomb and they're talking about all this. Where you look at like the bubbles in the water, and you
Hmm.
realize like what are like that looks very polluted, right? Extremely polluted, right? It looks almost like gelatin or something. Where that's not special effects, that is chemical residue. But anyways, um, people have theorized that that's why Tarkovsky died in his 50s, at a young age of his 50s. Many of the actors as well.
Yeah.
And I realized, when I was looking up, like who of the cast and crew is still alive. Presumably the child character is still alive. But of the adult actors, there's only two that are still alive. And it's the two women in the movie. His wife and the writer's, she's credited as writer's assistant, which I find funny. When it's just some woman he meets at a bar.
He's trying to convince her to join them
Yes.
on the trip to the
Yeah. Yeah.
zone. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And you think back and it's like, well, that's right. They're the only two characters besides the child who were never at the zone, right? Who were never immediately by all this toxic waste.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Also, when we're in the cafe, when they're not when you and me are, when they're at the cafe, you see in the distance, the nuclear reactor immediately by them, right? Which feels like the most like pointed like commentary that if you want to take the idea of it being commentary or interpretation of nuclear anxieties, um, pollution anxieties, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that it very much is like that, and obviously is just also background for just the industrial hellscape that they're living in,
Yeah,
right? Because it's much more grimy than an Antonioni movie in an industrial area like Red Desert or something.
totally, totally. Even the way that the city streets are built, it feels borderline expressionist, with like those
Mm.
harsh shadows and the completely anonymous facades. It's all run down. It's all dirty and dusty. It feels post-war, um, or post-catastrophe or something. It's so of its time, of how
Mhm.
things used to be. I do wonder how much actual production design they had to do here. Also, because you can kind of feel, especially if anyone watches Tarkovsky's movies chronologically, you do see this until Stalker, like they get progressively smaller in scale. I mean, it actually went from the sci-fi of Solaris, where you have the space shots. They're not glamorous like in 2001, but they're still there. There's still sets, things being built, floating in space, and all of that. Um, but here it's so simple that yeah, it feels like there was minimal work done. Of course, there was a lot of production design. Um, but even with the climax of the film, which is one of my favorite scenes, where the three men are outside of this room that's going to grant them their deepest wishes, that their heart desires, um, it is so much like a bunker type place. The deeper they go towards the room, um, the more polluted it gets, the less nature is present, the more human made objects and structures are taking shape. It's so intriguing. Even the idea of like the room is still a proper room inside of a space that was simply abandoned because of the zone, because of the area that became contaminated and impossible to navigate and it's dangerous. So there's definitely something there that there's further the further they go along, the more they abandon nature. Um, that is very unsettling as well. The whole film is very unsettling. The soundscape, the way it builds with these sounds of nature mixed with this musical soundtrack that's very subdued to then have those industrial noises. I don't know. It gets very very intense. But I also second what you said before with the ending of the child. I do love the monologue of the wife, and that feels like a monologue of hope in a way, or like the importance of keeping hope alive. The same way that you have, the stalker's breakdown in front of the room, and the scientist actually wants to destroy it because it's going to get weaponized in some way, by the government, by the military. I found it. We didn't mention it with the book, but it just came to mind as well that they actually use military industrial complex as a
Right.
term in the novel, which took me by surprise. I think it's the first time I've read it in a book that's yeah from the 70s. It was very surprising. Maybe part of the newer translations, potentially. I don't know, but still surprising how all of those elements, this distrust in governments, distrust in the military, in pretty much anyone doing anything good with this. Um, yeah. there's very little hope for the future of humanity, and yet Tarkovsky finds it through
Oh,
the next
sure.
generations, through also the inner journey that the stalker goes on, the same way that Red goes through it. It's yeah, men needing therapists basically, but they want to go to the zone first. It's one of those kinds
Classic,
of
classic, yes.
classics. Men would rather risk their lives finding the room that will grant them all their desires and have a mental breakdown in front of it before going to therapy.
No, exactly, exactly. I'm just imagining Stalker, like, well, you know how there's a break between part one and part two,
Hmm.
like like a grifter theater putting in like an ad for better health. For better health, I mean, there. Like, would you like your AI therapist
If they
talk
make
to
it
you in the
in
zone?
universe, yeah,
God, exactly,
Jesus.
exactly.
um
Well, what else? What
yes, do you
else?
have anything more you would like to add about the film or the book or the comparisons between the two, because we kind of already touched on both of our favorite scenes of the film.
Sure. It's funny. I want to reiterate again. They feel very different, right? The book and the movie.
Yes.
And it's funny watching the movie again and realizing I didn't know before that the screenplay was written by
Hmm.
the Strugatsky brothers. Of course, Tarkovsky had some things to say about that and did some editing, but not majorly, right? And things that happen naturally with filmmaking. What's interesting to me is how much it works because if you were to look at a script of the movie, I can't imagine it would be more you know than 60 pages long, right? Where
Just the
where
dialogues.
right, if you're talking about like the general idea, right, the rule of a page of a script being about a minute in the movie.
Hmm.
I don't know how many minutes in the movie are spent talking directly, but I can't imagine it's extensive. This isn't 12 Angry Men, right? So it's a very atmosphere focused thing. So it'd be kind of funny to see what the screenplay even looked like that could be translated into a movie. But to be fair, Eraserhead also had a script.
25
It's
pages.
yeah, like 12 pages or something. Yeah,
Amazing, amazing.
incredible.
And
But yeah,
I do think it's a major loss that when they had to change cinematographers, they lost funds and they had to then reshoot everything. Apparently, Tarkovsky did some major changes to the script because it said something about like you cannot recreate the same thing twice. I don't know, one of his quotes, classic Tarkovsky type quotes. Um, but I found it so interesting if the original version of the film, the one that they were shooting at first with the original cinematographer, was maybe closer in some ways to the book, because the idea of having those three characters that you follow was always present, of course. Um, but I can see that being one of those cases where, Strugatsky have the script, Tarkovsky approves it, they start shooting, they have problems, setbacks, they stop filming, and then Tarkovsky just like pencils everything out,
hmm,
rewrites some dialogues, rewrites some chapters, and then it's like, now we're doing it like this. And that's when we
right.
get the movie that we get now. I can see something like that being the truth. I'm surprised. I was looking for something about that, but apparently, yeah, the original editor had the footage at their home, the only negatives, and she died in a fire, and everything was lost in the 80s, 88 or something like that. So
Oh wow, had
yeah,
no
if it
idea.
was the editor, someone else still from the crew, um, had them. It's unfortunate, but.
No, it is very sad.
Mm,
And it's interesting. I'm reminded of with his first movie, Ivan's Childhood. They had a director before who had made about half the movie, but I think they fired the guy, or the guy left the production. So they hired Tarkovsky on to finish it. And then he said he was just going to, his rule, one of his rules for it was that he would just recreate the entire thing from scratch and he wouldn't watch a frame of the original movie.
Hmm.
And they were like, "Are you sure about that?" Because, then they would have half the money to remake the whole movie. And he said yes, which of course is why it feels, in some ways, like a very well done student film, right? Extensive shots in the woods, right? It feels like a skeleton crew. All for the better, of course, because it has the very bare nature that we kind of know as films we're having.
Hmm.
Which is funny because when you compare that to, say, Andrei Rublev, his next movie, which feels like this vast epic.
A true
I mean,
epic, yeah.
no, I mean, again, it feels like going from Ivan's childhood to like the to Cleopatra,
Hmm.
the $200 million one. So yeah, it's absolutely incredible. About the movie and the book, and any last thoughts? I'm trying to think. I did have one last little thing.
Yeah, please.
I think when it comes to desire, there's something very Zizekian, like
Mm.
literally relating to Slavoj Žižek, about the idea of desire in the movie, right? Where they do talk about it very directly in the movie, about you won't get what you think you want, right? You may think you want money or fame or whatever, but of course that's not how psychology actually works. Let alone, um, let alone anything else really in human psychology. So whatever they get gonna get is gonna be a surprise, for better or worse. And this aligns very much with Slavoj Žižek's ideology of psychoanalysis, rather, about the idea of we do not really know what we desire. That what we desire isn't what we think we may want, right? We may
Hmm.
want fame and money, but what we actually may desire is, um, to simply be content, right? Or to is not to be not ignorant and enlightened, but to understand that you're ignorant and be content with that, right? These much more common, unglamorous ideas.
Just happy to live
Yeah.
life and to lead life
Yes.
in a way,
Yes.
which is, yeah, you kind of see it here with the wife character, the monologue that she has, which is, completely forgot, it breaks the fourth wall. She's looking directly at us as she's speaking after talking with Stalker. Um, it's yeah, you see this man going through all of those. I don't know, I don't want to call them mental gymnastics, but they have so many doubts about the reason why they're there, which can it's the literal reason of why they're there, going to this room, going for what's in their deepest depths of the heart that they desire. But then it's also the literal reason why do they exist, why do we exist as people, as a species, and all those very light
Right.
existential questions. And the idea that we don't really know ourselves, we never really know ourselves fully. We may think we do, but then something happens in life that we react differently than we thought we would have, and that's is that we really are. Again, like you said, those Zizekian ideologies of never really knowing, and that's why I like this final part. I even have the quote, one of the quotes from the wife, where she talks about like never having regrets of getting with Stalker and having the daughter and everything, even though people were telling her no. She said, I've never regretted it nor envied anyone. It's just fate. It's life. It's us. And if there were no sorrow in our lives, it wouldn't be better. It would be worse. Because then there'd be no happiness either, and there'd be no hope. And I think
Right.
that's such a beautiful, almost final note to end the movie on. But then it complements what we were talking about with the daughter and telekinesis, because it's, yeah, it's touching. Life is in the living, life is in the experiencing it, and I think the breakdown of the stalker, that this is the only thing he's good at, this is the only thing he can do. Again, something we see in the book as well, the mental break at the end of just being like, this is who I am. I am this role. And even that is, I think, brilliant in the film of removing names. So it's not even American names, Russian names. People are identified by their role, their societal role almost. And they
Right.
will always be the stalker, someone that's looked down upon, that does this thing in secret. Yeah,
Right.
the
I mean, it's
criminal.
much more profound than, you know, than the names in, say, Dogs, where they're, Mr. White and Mr. Pink.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just
Because
randomly assigned. And
I did have the thought while watching it that I wonder if they were maybe giving each other those names um, as like a legal strategy. If they can't rat on each other if they're caught,
which I think
kind of a thing.
there's like a mention of, a slight mention of it. Is it maybe with the girl early on, where the guy's trying to introduce the stalker? And he says something like, "I'll just call me Stalker," or is it at the bar? It's like, just call him the writer. He's just the writer. Call him that. I don't know. There's one of those
Right.
moments, yeah, where I was thinking about it. So it's like, you cannot rat on anyone. You just know the role. You don't really know the name.
Exactly.
Yeah,
No, exactly. Exactly.
yeah.
Well, besides all that, I don't think I immediately have anything else to add. Do you?
I don't. Then I can go into the final question. You already answered to it, but then if you have anything less at the end that you would like to say after this conversation, then do you still prefer Tarkovsky's Stalker, or do you prefer Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers?
I was almost going to just yell Tarkovsky in the middle of your
It's
question.
like, I know it.
Um,
I know what I like.
yeah, yeah. It's funny because obviously the book came first,
Mhm.
but in reading the book, I did have the thought so many times where it's like, oh, why isn't the book faithful to the movie? What's going on?
Like, I don't remember this part.
Right. I mean, it's funny. I'm admittedly a fast reader, not really out of ability, partially out of impatience.
Necessity.
Um, and I'm working on a cute little beach read right now called Finnegan's Wake.
Light.
Um,
Very light.
very light, yes, which is really testing that for me. Uh, I think I talked about this earlier, but it's interesting because in the book you don't get a sense of it being really slow and tonal and poetic, right?
Mhm.
Uh,
It's quite fast paced, even, I would say, honestly.
it is. It is.
Surprisingly
And it
so.
is. And it is focused on more of these like, you know, pulpy kind of low frequency ideas of sex and violence and gore and day drinking, and it's all wonderful. It makes for an entertaining book. Um, but you can kind of see why Tarkovsky kind of cut that out. Not
Hmm.
that he can't have these things in his movies, and he does in some ways, but I think for him that might get in the way of one cinema as he sees it, which is a much more balanced thing than all that, and two, just well, I guess also censorship, right? Contemporary censorship
Yeah.
with the Russian censor board.
Mm.
Also, sorry, one last little thing I wanted to throw in. I never see people talk about the nature in the movie. Like, yes, the zone being this what it is, but the way that he films, water and natural scenes in it is kind of comparable to how he does it in the beginning of Solaris or in
Mm.
scenes from Nostalgia, right? Where it's not just his style, right? But there is some really vivid imagery to all this, um, and how he shoots nature. It's funny. I mean, I almost wish that if he had been alive longer, it would have been incredible to see what he would have done with a nature documentary,
Yeah, yeah.
possibly. But
Yeah.
anyways, that's its own thing. What about you? Do you have a preference?
I will second your thoughts. I also prefer the film, even though I actually ended up enjoying the book way more than I thought I would. And this is as someone that's not very much into sci-fi, but for me, it was a quite a fast read. Um, I found it more compelling than I was expecting. I think I also just naturally like pulpier stories. Like this was actually a beach read for me, literally. I read
Hmm.
all of it at the beach. Um, and I was dreading it. I thought, oh my god, I'm gonna be reading. Having read Solaris last year, I thought, oh my god, it's gonna be, heavier sci-fi, more heady. But actually, I was surprised by how simple it is. Simple in structure, not necessarily simple in content. Occasionally, um, but yeah, it was just engaging and fun. But Tarkovsky's film is genuinely at this point as legendary as the filmmaker himself. I think maybe the most loved of his works, the most influential, the most known. Um, Actually, we didn't mention it even once, but the whole idea of the term stalker became more popular through this film and through the book because it was just a character originally came, of course, from the verb to stalk, um, from the English language, but then there was Rudyard Kipling that had a character in one of his early books from the 1910s called Stalky. And the young Strugatsky brothers read that book and liked the name Stalky, and then they ended up naming these characters Stalkers because of that. And then the name just caught on afterwards, and then it became what we use now. Um, in the 90s, I thought it was just one of those fun little things because I think as a contemporary cinephile viewer, whatever reader, just going to watch something called Stalker, and it's this film is different than what most people would expect if you had no
Oh,
idea what you're getting into. I love the idea of just like Stalker. It's like it's gonna be a horror film. It's like Obsession. It's like the Backrooms, you know.
oh, sure. I mean, it's funny. That was the same for me. I mean, I thought it would be something more like Angst by Gerald Cargill,
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
homemaking
yeah, yeah.
film, or something like that. But of course, it has literally nothing to do with that. It's funny having to explain this. Like I did talk to my mom about the movie, telling her that I was going to be on a podcast.
Hmm.
She was like, Stalker? What? That's my horrible impression of her. But the point goes is having to explain, no, it means, a guy who stalks and is this wanderer in this area. I don't even think that's a translation issue because I know that's not true.
It's the
It's
actual
almost
name. I think it's like because there's a whole afterword. I don't know if your copy of the book had it. But there's this long afterword by one of the brothers, I think Arkady, sorry, I think Arkady wrote it. Um, or Boris, whatever. No, Boris. I think Boris Strugatsky wrote it, where they also touch upon this thing where it was like should have been written with a U, but the Russians pronounce it Stalker. I don't know. There was a whole thing. I remember in the video game, they called them Stalkers, and the game was made in Ukraine in 2005, 2006, and they had Ukrainian voice actors. So the way that they pronounce it is very adjacent to Russian pronunciation. So there is something slightly funny about it all. The way just, you know, one person's slight mistake in writing a name can change everyone's perception of it 30 years down the line. It's a fascinating
right.
little tidbit to end this conversation on.
Oh,
Uh,
certainly, certainly. And I
Alden,
think we just crossed the 2 hour
yeah,
period.
yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah.
I
There's
am
a
happy.
feature length.
Yes, I mean, for Tarkovsky, this would be a beach watch.
Yeah,
I don't know what
yeah.
that would mean. I'm imagining him watching his own movie on like an Apple Watch or something.
That would be amazing. That's a
As it
fun
was,
with a mustache, thick mustache,
yeah,
just chilling on a
exactly.
beach. Um,
Yes,
Thank you for joining me on this stalkery adventure through the zone.
yes, yes.
For the
Thank you for
listeners
having me.
that got, of course, my pleasure. For the listeners that listened this far, where can they find you? Do you have anything that you would like to plug?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, Yeah, I have a Substack where you can follow me. It is my name, Alden Nagel. And I have an Instagram, Alden Nagel. And I have a Venmo, Alden Nagel, which you can send me money.
To help buy
Other
more
than that,
books.
no. Yes, yes. I have a master's thesis I'm working on right now, which would be nice to publish. And but that's way down the line on the author Talden. And oh yeah, here's something I can really plug. I have a book with the Japanese writer Kenji Surutori coming out next month called Godzilla Cells,
There
which
you
is
go.
not really about Godzilla. It's about experimental literature and theory and very academic stuff that goes over my head. But I pretend to know it
I'm sure you
very
know
well
it.
enough.
I'm sure
Yeah,
you're downplaying it. You're downplaying it.
I think the document knows when I've written my thoughts together. I don't. Well, that's not entirely true. We can do part two, Tarkovsky's Godzilla Cells. Anyways,
Amazing.
that's all.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you, Nick.
no, my pleasure. Links to those things are going to be in the show notes for the listeners. Um, Meanwhile, you can follow me pretty much everywhere at NickGrind97, and of course, you can follow this very podcast on Instagram at Anatomy of Adaptation Pod to stay tuned with all past and future episodes. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a lovely, lovely day, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.